I've never told this story to anyone except my therapist. For 20 years, I convinced myself it was just childhood imagination, the kind of thing kids make up when they spend too much time alone. But last month, I found something in my grandmother's attic that changed everything. Now I can't sleep, and I need to get this out before it drives me completely insane. My name is Sarah, and I'm 28 years old. When I was 8, my family lived on a wheat farm about 40 miles outside Billings, Montana. This was 1995, back when kids still played outside until dark, and parents didn't worry about every shadow. Our house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by golden fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, just a tiny speck of light you could see through the kitchen window on clear nights. My parents worked from sunrise to sunset during harvest season. Dad would be out on the combine until well past dark, and Mom spent her days managing the grain sales and farm paperwork. This meant I was alone a lot after school, which never bothered me. I was a quiet kid who preferred books to people anyway. It started on a Tuesday in late September. I was sitting at the kitchen table working on homework when I glanced out the window toward the tree line that marked the eastern edge of our property. That's when I saw him for the first time. A man in a red flannel shirt, standing perfectly still about 200 yards away. He was too far to make out any facial features, just a dark silhouette against the golden wheat. But I could tell he was facing our house, watching. I stared for maybe 30 seconds, waiting for him to move or wave or do something normal. He didn't. When I blinked and looked again, he was gone. At dinner, I mentioned seeing someone by the trees. Dad barely looked up from his meatloaf. "Probably Jim checking his cattle fence," he said. "That section runs right along our property line." But I knew Jim Morrison, our neighbor. He was a short, stocky man who always wore a John Deere cap. This person had been tall and thin, and I'd never seen Jim in anything but his faded denim work shirts. The man appeared again 2 days later, this time just as I was getting off the school bus. Same red flannel shirt, same motionless stance, same position by the tree line. I watched him through my bedroom window while I pretended to do homework. He stood there for exactly 12 minutes, I timed it, then simply walked backward into the trees until I couldn't see him anymore. This became a routine. Every few days, always around dusk, the man in red flannel would appear somewhere on the edges of our property. Sometimes by the trees, sometimes near the old barn that sat unused at the far end of our driveway, once standing right beside our mailbox at the main road, always watching the house, always perfectly still. I started keeping a notebook, documenting every sighting, the date, or the time, his exact location, what he was wearing. It was always the same red and black checkered flannel shirt, dark pants, and work boots. I even tried drawing him, though my 8-year-old artistic skills weren't much to speak of. My parents grew increasingly concerned about what they called my fixation. Mom started asking if I was having trouble at school, if kids were being mean to me. Dad wondered if I needed glasses. When I showed them my notebook with 2 weeks' worth of documented sightings, they exchanged the kind of look parents give each other when they think their child might need professional help. "Honey," Mom said gently, "you have a very active imagination. But sometimes when we're alone a lot, our minds can play tricks on us." I stopped talking to them about it after that, but I didn't stop watching. The sightings continued through October and into November. The man never came closer than about 100 yards from the house, and he never did anything threatening. He just watched. But there was something in his stillness that made my skin crawl. Normal people fidget, shift their weight, scratch an itch. This man stood like a statue until he decided to leave. Then things started getting strange in other ways. Our dog, Rusty, began refusing to go outside after sunset. He was a farm dog, used to roaming our property freely, but suddenly he would whine and cower if we tried to put him out for his evening bathroom break. He'd stand at the door, trembling, looking out at the yard like he could see something we couldn't. Mom found footprints in her vegetable garden, large boot prints that circled the tomato plants. Dad assumed they were his own, though he swore he hadn't been near the garden in weeks. The prints appeared again after the next rain, in the exact same pattern. One morning, I discovered someone had been on our porch during the night. 3 of the wooden planks creaked when you stepped on them. I knew, because I'd been using them as a warning system to sneak out and back in after my parents went to bed. All 3 creaky boards showed fresh mud prints, as if someone had stood there for a long time, shifting their weight from foot to foot. I started having trouble sleeping. My bedroom window faced east toward the tree line, and I found myself checking it compulsively throughout the night. I never saw the man after dark, but I had the constant feeling of being watched. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I'd turn to look, there was nothing there. The worst incident happened on a cold Thursday night in late November. I'd been lying in bed for about an hour, reading by flashlight under my covers, when Rusty started barking frantically from downstairs. Not his normal bark. This was the sound of an animal in genuine distress. I crept to my window and peeked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing but the usual view of dark fields and distant trees. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw him. The man in the red flannel shirt was standing directly outside my bedroom window, maybe 3 feet from the glass, close enough that I could finally see his face. He was old, probably in his 70s, with deep-set eyes and hollow cheeks. His skin had a waxy, unnatural quality, like old leather that had been left out in the weather too long. But the worst part was his expression. He wasn't just watching the house anymore. He was staring directly at me, and his mouth was moving slightly, like he was whispering something I couldn't hear. I screamed. The sound brought my parents running, but by the time Dad reached my room with his shotgun, the man was gone. Mom held me while I sobbed and tried to explain what I'd seen. But all they found outside was disturbed ground beneath my window and a single red thread caught on the window screen. That thread changed everything. Dad called the sheriff the next morning. Deputy Martinez came out to take my statement and examine the evidence. The thread was definitely from a flannel shirt, and the footprints under my window were clear and undeniable. Someone had been standing there, watching me sleep. The investigation that followed revealed something that made my parents' faces go white with fear. Over the past 10 years, there had been dozens of reports throughout the county of a man in a red flannel shirt appearing on people's property. Always watching, never approaching, never speaking. Most reports came from families with young children living in isolated areas. 3 families had filed restraint orders against unknown individuals, though no one had ever been caught or identified. 2 families had moved away after their children became too afraid to sleep in their own bedrooms. We installed motion sensor lights around the entire house, and Dad got a security system that would trip if anyone came within 50 feet of our doors or windows. Mom started driving me to and from the school bus stop instead of letting me walk the quarter-mile driveway alone. But the man in the red flannel never appeared again. Days turned into weeks, then months. I gradually stopped checking my window every night, though I never slept with the curtains open again. My parents decided the security measures had worked, that whoever had been stalking our family had moved on to easier targets. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be, for a kid who'd spent months being watched by a stranger. I stopped having nightmares about hollow eyes and moving lips outside my window. The notebook full of sightings got buried in a desk drawer, then eventually thrown away. I grew up, graduated high school, went to college in Seattle. I rarely thought about the man in the red flannel anymore, except when I had to explain to therapists why I couldn't sleep with my bedroom curtains open. Then last month, my grandmother passed away. She'd lived in the same house in Billings for 60 years, and cleaning out her attic was like archaeological excavation through our family's history. Photo albums, baby clothes, military uniforms, boxes of letters and documents. I was working through a trunk of pictures from the 1950s when I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a black and white photograph of our family farm, taken from the road looking toward the house. Standing in the exact spot where I'd first seen the man in red flannel, by the tree line facing the house, was a figure in a checkered shirt. The photo was dated 1952 on the back, and my grandmother's handwriting. Dad watching over the place, as always. I called my grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd known our family for decades. She told me the man in the photo was my great-grandfather, Walter Morrison. He died in 1963, but for years before his death, he'd made it his daily routine to walk the property boundaries, checking on the crops and keeping watch over the family land. He was very protective, Mrs. Chen said, always worried about strangers bothering the family. He'd stand guard sometimes for hours, just making sure everything was safe. I found more photos. Walter in his signature red and black flannel shirt, standing by the barn. Walter next to the mailbox, always facing toward the house. Walter in the yard, in the fields, by the tree line, always watching, always protecting. According to Mrs. Chen, Walter had been especially protective of children. He'd raised 7 kids of his own and was constantly worried about their safety in such an isolated area. Even after his children grew up and moved away, he continued his vigilant patrols of the property. He used to say the land needed a guardian, she told me. Someone to keep watch when the family couldn't. I spent hours comparing the old photographs to my childhood drawings and written descriptions. The height, the build, the clothes, even the locations, everything matched perfectly. But Walter Morrison had been dead for 32 years when I started seeing the man in red flannel. I called Deputy Martinez, who'd retired but still lived in the area. He remembered my case and several others involving similar sightings. When I told him about the photographs and family connection, he was quiet for a long time. "Sarah," he finally said, "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but we had reports of that red flannel man going back to the early 1970s. Always the same description. Always on properties that had been in the Morrison family. Your great-grandfather's farm, his brother's place up north, your cousin's ranch near Laurel. Always families with young kids." "But that's impossible," I said. "Walter died in 1963. "I know," he replied. "That's what made the case so strange. We could never figure out who was doing it, or why they seemed to know so much about your family's properties." I haven't slept well since that conversation. Part of me wants to believe that some homeless drifter had been squatting on our land, wearing clothes similar to my great-grandfather's. Maybe he'd found Walter's old shirts in an abandoned outbuilding, and the resemblance was just coincidence. But I keep thinking about that final night, when I saw his face through my bedroom window. The hollow eyes, the weathered skin, the lips moving in silent words. What had he been trying to tell me? And I remember something else, something I'd forgotten until now. That last night, just before I screamed, I thought I heard something. Not with my ears, but in my mind, like a whisper that came from inside my own thoughts. "Sleep safe, little one. Grandpa Walter's watching. I don't know what to believe anymore. Was I being stalked by a dangerous stranger, or protected by someone who loved our family so much that death couldn't stop him from standing guard? All I know is that sometimes, when I'm visiting my parents at the old farm, I catch myself looking toward the tree line at dusk. And sometimes, just for a second, I think I see a familiar figure in a red flannel shirt, still keeping watch over the place he never really left. I like to think he's still protecting us, but late at night, When the wind is howling across those empty Montana fields, I'm not entirely sure. If you're still listening to this, you probably understand why some stories stick with us, no matter how hard we try to forget them. I don't usually ask, but if this is getting under your skin the way it did mine, show it some love. A like or comment really helps keep stories like this alive. And trust me, there are more where this came from. I moved to Alabama when I was 12, and all I wanted was to fit in with the local kids. They had this secret spot, a swimming hole deep in the woods that only they knew about. Getting invited there felt like joining some exclusive club. But there are some clubs you should never want to join, and some secrets that are kept for a reason. My name is Marcus, and I'm 35 now. But in the summer of 1999, I was just a scared kid trying to find his place in a town where everyone else had known each other since birth. We'd moved to Millerville, Alabama that spring when my dad got transferred to the paper mill. It's one of those towns that barely qualifies as a town. Maybe 800 people spread across dirt roads and trailer parks, surrounded by dense pine forests that seem to swallow up the horizon. The kind of place where kids make their own entertainment because there's nothing else to do. I spent the first month of summer vacation completely alone, watching the other kids from my bedroom window as they rode their bikes in packs through the neighborhood, knowing secrets I wasn't part of. They weren't mean to me exactly, but they weren't welcoming either. I was the outsider, the Yankee kid from Michigan who didn't know the unspoken rules of southern small-town life. Then one blazing hot afternoon in July, everything changed. I was sitting on our front porch reading a comic book when Tyler Morrison and his crew pulled up on their bikes. Tyler was 13, the unofficial leader of the local kids, all sun-bleached hair and easy confidence. Behind him were Jenny, Caleb, and the twins, Matt and Mark. "Hey, Michigan," Tyler called out, which had become my unofficial nickname. "You want to go swimming?" The closest public pool was 20 miles away in the county seat, and my parents had been too busy with work to take me. I'd been dying to cool off for weeks. "Where?" I asked, trying not to sound too eager. Tyler grinned. "The hole. But you can't tell any adults about it, understand? It's our place." I nodded quickly and grabbed my swim trunks from inside. Finally, I was being included. The bike ride took us through downtown Millerville, 3 blocks of mostly empty storefronts and a single gas station, then onto a dirt road that wound deep into the pine woods. We rode for maybe 20 minutes, following paths that seemed to appear and disappear between the trees, until finally, Tyler stopped his bike and pointed into the forest. "We walk from here," he said. "And remember, if anyone asks, you've never been here." The trail was barely visible, just a narrow gap between massive pine trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. We walked single file for about 10 minutes, branches catching at our clothes and mosquitoes buzzing around our faces. Just when I was starting to wonder if Tyler was playing some elaborate prank on the new kid, we emerged into a clearing. The swimming hole was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the cheerful, sun-dappled pond I'd imagined, this was a dark circle of water, maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The water was so black, I couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface, and it was perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the canopy above. "This is it," Tyler announced, already pulling off his t-shirt. "Best swimming spot in 3 counties." The other kids were stripping down to their swimsuits, chattering excitedly about how good the cool water was going to feel. But something about the place made my skin crawl. The silence was wrong. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the soft sound of water lapping against the muddy shore. And the temperature was wrong too. Even in the shade, it had to be 90 degrees. but the air around the water felt cold, like standing in front of an open freezer. "Come on, Michigan," Jenny called, already wading into the shallows. "Don't be a baby." I forced myself to undress and followed them in. The water was shockingly cold, cold enough to make me gasp and set my teeth chattering. But the others didn't seem to notice. They splashed and laughed and dove beneath the surface like it was perfectly normal. I stayed in the shallow area near the shore, trying to work up the courage to go deeper. That's when I felt something brush against my leg. It wasn't a fish. The touch was too deliberate, too much like fingers trailing across my shin. I jerked backward, heart hammering, and looked around for whatever had touched me. The water was too dark to see anything below the surface. "Did you guys feel that?" I called out to the others. "Feel what?" Tyler replied, floating on his back about 10 feet away. "Something touched me. Something in the water." The other kids exchanged glances, and Jenny giggled. "Probably just a catfish, Marcus. They're harmless." But I noticed something as I watched them swim. Despite all their splashing and diving, none of them were going into the deeper parts of the hole. They stayed in a rough circle around the edges, never venturing more than 15 feet from shore. We spent about an hour at the swimming hole, and by the time we left, I'd started to relax. Maybe I'd just been spooked by the unfamiliar setting. The other kids seemed comfortable there, and they'd obviously been coming to this place for years. But as we gathered our clothes and prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Scattered around the clearing, half hidden in the tall grass and fallen leaves, were personal items. A child's flip-flop, faded and covered in mold. A waterlogged backpack with cartoon characters I didn't recognize. A pair of swim goggles with a cracked lens. "Whose stuff is this?" I asked, pointing to the flip-flop. Tyler barely glanced at it. "It's always been there," he said with a shrug. "People lose things." But the items looked like they'd been there for more than just a few swimming seasons. They looked ancient, like artifacts from some previous generation of kids who discovered this place. And then, what? Moved away? Grown up? Over the next few weeks, I became a regular at the swimming hole. The other kids had finally accepted me, and I wasn't about to jeopardize that by asking too many questions about the strange atmosphere of the place. But I couldn't shake my uneasiness, and I started paying attention to details the others seemed to ignore. The personal items weren't random junk left behind by careless swimmers. They were too specific, too personal. A child's retainer in a pink case. A class ring from Millerville High School dated 1987. A waterlogged diary with pages too damaged to read, but with a name inscribed on the inside cover. Rebecca Ann Porter, age 10. I started visiting the public library, telling my mom I was working on a summer reading project. What I was really doing was searching through old newspapers, looking for any mention of the swimming hole or the names I'd found on the scattered belongings. What I found made my blood run cold. The Millerville Gazette had been reporting on missing children for decades. Not every year, but often enough to form a pattern. A 10-year-old girl named Rebecca Porter had disappeared in the summer of 1987. The search teams had found her bicycle at the edge of the woods, but never found Rebecca herself. The case was closed after 6 months, listed as a probable runaway. In 1991, a boy named Danny Hutchins had vanished during a family camping trip. He'd gone for a walk in the woods and never returned. Again, no body was ever found. 1994, Sarah Michelle Davies, age 9, disappeared while playing in the woods behind her house. 1996, Tommy Valdez, age 11, last seen riding his bike toward the forest. 1998, Ashley Monroe, age 8, vanished during a game of hide-and-seek with her cousins. All the disappearances happened during the summer months. All the children were between 8 and 12 years old, and all of them had last been seen heading toward the same section of woods where our secret swimming hole was located. I tried to bring this up with Tyler and the others, but they just laughed it off. "You watch too much TV, Michigan," Tyler said. "Kids don't get murdered in Millerville. They just move to different towns and don't bother to say goodbye." But I could see something in his eyes when he said it. A flicker of uncertainty, like maybe he'd wondered about those missing kids too, but had never wanted to voice his concerns. The breaking point came in early August. We were having one of our regular afternoon swims when Matt, one of the twins, decided to show off by diving deeper than usual. He took a big breath and disappeared beneath the black surface, heading toward the center of the hole where none of us usually went. He was down there too long. Way too long. "Where is he?" Mark asked, looking around frantically for his brother. "He should have come up by now." We all started calling Matt's name, scanning the surface for any sign of him. The water remained perfectly still, like glass. Then suddenly, about 20 feet from shore, Matt's head broke the surface. He was gasping and choking, his face white with terror. "Something's down there," he screamed as we pulled him to shore. "Something grabbed me." Matt was shaking so hard he could barely speak. When he finally calmed down enough to tell us what had happened, his story made no sense. "I dove down to see how deep it goes," he said. "It just kept going and going, like there's no bottom. But when I tried to swim back up, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down, and there were hands reaching up from the bottom. Lots of hands." Tyler tried to convince him he'd just gotten tangled in some underwater vegetation, but Matt shook his head violently. "They felt like people hands," he insisted. "Cold and soft, like they'd been underwater for a long time." None of us went swimming that day. In fact, I never went back to the swimming hole again, though the others continued their regular visits. I made excuses. Stomachache, grounded, had to help my dad with yard work. Anything to avoid returning to that dark circle of water in the woods. But I couldn't stop thinking about Matt's story, or about all those missing children, or about the personal belongings scattered around the clearing like some kind of memorial. 2 weeks later, my worst fears were confirmed. Tommy Valdez, Tyler's younger cousin, had been visiting from Birmingham for a week. Tommy was 11, small for his age, and desperate to impress the older kids. When Tyler finally agreed to bring him to the swimming hole, I felt sick with dread, but didn't know how to stop it without sounding crazy. The next morning, Tommy's parents called the police. He'd never come home from his swimming trip. The search and rescue teams combed every inch of the woods around Millerville. They brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteer searchers from 3 counties. They dragged every pond and creek in a 10-mile radius. They never found Tommy's body, but I knew where he was. When the police questioned us about Tommy's disappearance, we all told the same story, that we'd been swimming at Miller's Creek, a well-known spot closer to town. Tyler had coached us on what to say, insisting that revealing the location of our secret swimming hole would just get us all in trouble without helping find Tommy. "He probably just got lost in the woods," Tyler said, but his voice was hollow. Kids get turned around all the time. The official investigation concluded that Tommy had likely fallen into one of the many hidden sinkholes that dotted the Alabama forest floor. Case closed, family devastated. Life moved on. But I couldn't move on. I started having nightmares about that black water, about pale hands reaching up from the depths, about Tommy's face sinking into darkness while we splashed around obliviously in the shallows. I would wake up, gasping, feeling like I was drowning. My parents noticed my behavior change and took me to see a counselor, thinking I was having trouble adjusting to the move. I wanted to tell someone the truth, but who would believe me? And what good would it do now? The other kids eventually stopped inviting me to hang out. I think my guilt and paranoia made them uncomfortable, reminded them of things they'd rather forget. Tyler's family moved away that fall, and the twins started avoiding me completely. I managed to finish out my childhood in Millerville, but I never felt safe there again. Every summer, I'd watch the local news, waiting for reports of another missing child. Sometimes my fears were confirmed. A kid would vanish while playing in the woods, or a family would report their child missing after a camping trip. The pattern continued. When I graduated high school, I left Alabama and never looked back. I went to college in Ohio, got a job in marketing, started a family. I thought I'd put the whole nightmare behind me. But last month, I received a Facebook message that brought it all rushing back. It was from Jenny, Tyler's old girlfriend from our swimming days. She was a nurse now, living in Mobile, and she'd been following missing person cases throughout southern Alabama as part of her volunteer work with a children's advocacy group. Marcus, her message read, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think I figured out what happened to Tommy and all those other kids. I've been researching the history of that place we used to swim, and I found something you need to see. She'd attached a link to a historical society website about Millerville's past. According to the records, our secret swimming hole had once been the site of something much darker. In the 1920s, before the area was settled by white families, it had been used as an execution site. Local authorities would bring condemned prisoners, mostly black men accused of crimes they likely didn't commit, and drown them in the deep water as a form of rough justice. Over a dozen men had been murdered there before the practice was finally stopped. But the killings hadn't stopped there. During the Great Depression, when food was scarce and desperation ran high, some of the local families had used the hole for a different purpose. Children who were too sick to care for, or too many mouths to feed, were brought to the water in the middle of the night and quietly disposed of. No records were kept, no graves were marked. The families simply told neighbors that their children had died of fever or moved away to live with relatives. The Historical Society estimated that at least 20 people, most of them children, had been murdered at the site between 1925 and 1940. The old-timers call it cursed water, Jenny's message continued. They say once that many souls are trapped in one place, it develops a hunger that can never be satisfied. Every few years, it needs to feed again. I stared at my computer screen, my hands shaking as I read her words. It all made horrible sense. The cold water in the middle of summer, the way we'd all instinctively avoided the deeper areas, the personal belongings of missing children scattered around the shore like offerings, and Matt's story about the hands reaching up from the bottom, trying to drag him down to join the others. Jenny had tried to report her findings to the police, but they dismissed her research as local folklore mixed with coincidence. Missing children cases were already difficult to solve, and the authorities weren't interested in investigating a swimming hole based on 90-year-old ghost stories. But Jenny wasn't giving up. She'd organized a group of volunteers to drain the swimming hole, to finally search its depths and give the families of missing children some closure. The drainage began last week. According to Jenny's latest message, they've pumped out about half the water so far, and they've already found more than they bargained for. Bones. Lots of bones. Some old enough to crumble at the touch, others more recent. Personal effects from children who disappeared over the decades. And at the very bottom, in the deepest part of the hole, they found something that made the local police finally take notice. A collection of children's belongings arranged in careful patterns, like some kind of shrine or offering. Toys, clothes, jewelry, school supplies, all laid out as if someone or something had been collecting trophies from every child who'd entered that dark water. The FBI has taken over the investigation now. They're treating it as a potential serial killer case, though they can't explain how the murders could have continued for so many decades without anyone being caught. But I know the truth, and so does Jenny, and probably so did Tyler and the twins, and all the other kids who spent their summer swimming in cursed water, trying not to think about the hands that might be reaching up from below. Some places are hungry. Some places never stop feeding. And some secrets are buried so deep that even draining the water can't bring them to light. I still have nightmares about that swimming hole. I wake up feeling like I'm drowning, like cold fingers are wrapped around my ankles, trying to drag me down into darkness. Sometimes I dream that I'm 11 years old again, standing on the shore, watching Tommy's head disappear beneath the black surface, while I do nothing to save him. I should have spoken up. I should have told someone about the missing children, about the personal belongings, about the way that water felt wrong from the very first day. Maybe Tommy would still be alive. Maybe other kids would have been saved. But I was just a scared 12-year-old who wanted to fit in, who was willing to ignore every warning sign to be part of the group. Now I'm 35, and I still can't take a bath without thinking about what's lurking beneath the surface. I live in Colorado now, as far from Alabama as I could get. But sometimes when I drive past mountain lakes or forest ponds, I feel that old chill creeping up my spine. Because I know that not all water is safe. Some of it carries memories, and some of those memories are hungry for more. Time doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Most people never notice because they're too busy living in it. But sometimes you get caught in a place where the clocks run backward and the same minute happens over and over again. I learned this when I was 10 years old, trapped in a grocery store that shouldn't have existed. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really left. My name is Jennifer, and I'm 31 years old. But on a cold February night in 1993, I was 10 years old and living in Hartwell, Ohio, population 847. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where nothing exciting ever happens, and where the most dangerous thing you might encounter is black ice on the back roads. That night started like any ordinary winter evening. My dad had come down with the flu that was going around, the kind that left you shivering and achy no matter how many blankets you piled on. Mom had been giving him aspirin and hot tea all day, but by 9 o'clock his fever had spiked to 103 degrees. "I need to get him some real medicine," she told me, wrapping herself in her heavy winter coat. But the pharmacy closed at 6. The only place still open was Hartwell's Market, a 24-hour grocery store that sat on Main Street like a fluorescent island in an ocean of darkness. It wasn't much to look at, a low rectangular building with faded yellow siding and windows covered in beer advertisements and lottery ticket signs. But it was the only game in town if you needed something after regular business hours. "Can I come with you?" I asked. The alternative was staying home alone with my sick father, listening to him moan and cough through the thin walls of our old house. Mom hesitated. It was already past my bedtime, and she'd have to bundle me up against the cold that had been gripping Ohio for the past week. But I think she didn't want to leave me alone either. "All right," she said finally. "But you stay close to me, and we're in and out as fast as possible." The drive to town took about 15 minutes on roads that were slick with ice and bordered by snow-covered cornfields. Our headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty farmland and the occasional farmhouse window glowing yellow in the distance. Hartwell's Market sat in the middle of Main Street like a beacon, its parking lot illuminated by tall sodium lights that cast everything in a sickly orange glow. There were only 3 other cars in the lot, which was normal for a Tuesday night in February. We parked near the front entrance, and I followed Mom through the automatic doors into the artificial warmth of the store. The familiar smell hit me immediately, that mix of floor cleaner, old vegetables, and something vaguely industrial that all grocery stores seem to have. Mrs. Chen, the overnight cashier, looked up from her magazine and smiled at us. She was a tiny Korean woman who'd been working nights at the store for as long as I could remember. My husband ran the day shift, and together they kept the place running around the clock. "Evening, Dorothy," she said to my mom. "How's Bill feeling?" "Not good," Mom replied. heading straight for the pharmacy section at the back of the store. I need something stronger than aspirin. I wandered along behind her, not really paying attention to where we were going. The store was laid out in a simple grid, 5 aisles running from front to back, with the pharmacy, deli, and frozen foods along the rear wall. I'd been there hundreds of times and could navigate it with my eyes closed. That's why it took me a moment to realize something was wrong. We'd been in the store for maybe 5 minutes when I glanced up at the clock above the pharmacy counter. It read 11:47 p.m. I remembered checking my watch in the car just before we got out. It had been 11:30 p.m. then, and the drive from the parking lot to the medicine aisle couldn't have taken more than 2 or 3 minutes. But now my watch said 11:52 p.m. I stared at the 2 timepieces, trying to figure out how they could be showing different times. Maybe my watch was running fast, or maybe the store clock was wrong. It didn't seem important enough to mention to Mom, who was busy comparing cold medicines and muttering about which one would be strongest. I wandered away from the pharmacy section, letting my eyes drift over the familiar layout of the store. That's when I noticed the other customers. There was a man by the frozen food section, wearing shorts and a t-shirt despite the February cold outside. He was standing perfectly still in front of the ice cream freezer, not moving, not reaching for anything, just staring at the rows of frozen treats like he was trying to solve some complex mathematical equation. Near the front of the store, a woman was loading her cart with cans of tomato soup. Nothing unusual about that, except she already had 47 cans in her cart. I counted them, and she was still adding more. Can after can after can, each one identical to the last. And by the magazine rack, an elderly man was whispering to himself in a continuous stream, too quietly for me to make out the words, but loud enough that I could hear the constant murmur of his voice. I looked around for Mrs. Chen to see if she'd noticed the strange behavior, but she was at her register scanning items for a customer I hadn't seen come in. The customer was a middle-aged woman in a business suit, which struck me as odd, since it was almost midnight on a Tuesday in rural Ohio. Where would someone be coming from in business attire at this hour? Mom appeared at my elbow, with a basket containing fever reducer, throat lozenges, and a bottle of cough syrup. "Ready to go?" she asked. I nodded, but as we headed toward the checkout, I glanced up at the clock again. It still read 11:47 p.m. My watch now showed 11:58 p.m. "Mom," I said quietly, "look at that clock." She followed my gaze to the pharmacy counter. "What about it? What time does it say?" "12:15. Why?" I looked at my watch again. 11:59 p.m. Then, as I watched, the minute hand clicked over to 12 a.m. The store clock still read 11:47 p.m. "That's weird," Mom said with a shrug. "Store clocks are always wrong. Come on, let's pay and get home to your father." But as we approached Mrs. Chen's register, I noticed something else that made my stomach clench with unease. The customer in the business suit was still being rung up, and Mrs. Chen was scanning the same items over and over again. A box of crackers, beep. A can of soda, beep. A package of lunch meat, beep. Then she'd start over with the same box of crackers. The customer didn't seem to notice. She stood there patiently, purse in hand, waiting for a transaction that would apparently never end. "Excuse me," Mom said politely. Mrs. Chen looked up with her usual smile, but there was something different about her expression. Her eyes seemed unfocused, like she was looking through us rather than at us. "Good evening," she said. "How can I help you?" Mom placed our items on the counter. Mrs. Chen began scanning them, but instead of the normal beeping sound, I heard something else. A television commercial playing from the small TV mounted behind the register. "New and improved Tide detergent gets your clothes cleaner than ever before." I'd heard that exact commercial when we first walked into the store 20 minutes ago. In fact, I was pretty sure I'd heard it several times since then. But now, I was paying attention, and I realized the commercial was playing on a loop, the same 30-second spot over and over, with no breaks for other advertisements or programming. Mrs. Chen finished scanning our items. "That'll be $18.47, she said. Mom handed her a $20 bill. Mrs. Chen opened the register, made change, and handed back $1.53. Then she immediately began scanning our items again. Mom said. "We already paid." Mrs. Chen looked up with that same unfocused smile. "Good evening," she said. "How can I help you?" She scanned the fever reducer. Beep. The throat lozenges. Beep. The cough syrup. Beep. "That'll be $18.47. Mom looked at me, confusion written across her face. "Mrs. Chen, we just paid for these items. Don't you remember?" But Mrs. Chen was already reaching for the receipt paper, apparently preparing to start the transaction over again. I grabbed Mom's arm. "Let's just go," I whispered. We backed away from the register, leaving our items on the counter. Mrs. Chen continued going through the motions of a sale with no customers, scanning invisible products and talking to empty air. "What the hell is happening here?" Mom muttered. That's when I noticed the other customers were still doing exactly what they'd been doing when we arrived. The man in summer clothes still stood motionless in front of the ice cream freezer. The woman with the shopping cart was still loading identical cans of soup, though her cart now seemed to contain hundreds of them, stacked impossibly high. The elderly man continued his whispered monologue, the same stream of unintelligible words flowing from his lips. And the clock above the pharmacy still read 11:47 p.m. I looked at my watch. 12:17 a.m. "Mom, we need to leave right now." She didn't argue. We headed for the automatic doors, but when we reached them, nothing happened. The sensors didn't detect our presence, and the doors remained firmly closed. Mom pushed against the glass, but they wouldn't budge. She looked around frantically for a manual release or an emergency exit, but the doors were the only way out of the main shopping area. "There has to be another exit," she said, trying to keep her voice calm for my sake. "Stores are required to have multiple exits." We walked toward the back of the store, past the pharmacy and the deli counter. There was a hallway marked "Employees Only" that led deeper into the building. We had no choice but to follow it. The hallway was longer than it should have been. Much longer. We walked for what felt like several minutes, passing door after door, marked with signs I couldn't read in the dim light. Storage rooms, maybe, or offices. But the hallway just kept going, stretching into darkness ahead of us. "This is impossible," Mom whispered. "The building isn't this big." I knew she was right. From outside, Hartwell's Market was maybe 100 feet deep. We'd already walked farther than that, and the hallway showed no sign of ending. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Behind us, echoing from the direction we'd come, was the sound of the automatic doors opening and closing, over and over, like someone was walking in and out of the store repeatedly. But we'd just established that the doors wouldn't open. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone else is in here." We stopped walking and listened. The sound continued. Whoosh, ding, whoosh, ding. The familiar rhythm of customers entering and leaving a store. But underneath that, I could hear other sounds. Shopping carts rolling across linoleum. The beeping of barcode scanners. The murmur of conversation and the rustle of shopping bags. It sounded like the store was full of customers, even though we'd only seen 4 other people when we arrived. "We're going back," Mom decided. "Whatever's happening, we need to get out of here." We turned around and retraced our steps, but the hallway seemed even longer in the other direction. We walked and walked, but the sounds of the busy store never got any closer. If anything, they seemed to be fading, as if we were moving away from them instead of toward them. Finally, after what felt like hours, We reached a door marked Exit. Mom pushed it open, and we found ourselves back in the main store area. But it wasn't the same store we'd left. The aisles were packed with customers now, dozens of people pushing shopping carts and examining products. But they all moved with the same mechanical precision as the original 4 customers we'd encountered. A woman selected a box of cereal from the shelf, examined it for exactly 3 seconds, then placed it in her cart and moved to the next item. A man compared 2 brands of pasta sauce, nodded once, and made his selection. A teenage boy bagged groceries at a checkout counter that hadn't been open when we first arrived. They all looked normal, like typical small-town residents doing their weekly shopping. But there was something wrong with their movements, something too perfect and rehearsed, like actors performing a play they'd memorized but didn't understand. And every single one of them was wearing clothes from a different decade. The woman with the cereal was dressed like it was 1985. Big shoulder pads, bright colors, feathered hair. The man with the pasta sauce looked like he'd stepped out of the 1970s, complete with wide lapels and bell-bottom pants. A family near the produce section was dressed in 1950s attire. The father in a narrow tie and fedora. The mother in a circle skirt and cardigan. "Do you see this?" I whispered to Mom. But when I looked at her, she was staring straight ahead, with the same unfocused expression I'd seen on Mrs. Chen's face. Her eyes were glassy, and she was moving toward the shopping carts with slow, mechanical steps. "Mom!" I grabbed her arm, trying to stop her. She looked down at me, and for a moment her eyes cleared. "Jennifer? What? Where are we?" "We're still in the store, Mom. Something's wrong with this place." She blinked several times, shaking her head like she was trying to clear away cobwebs. "I felt like I was dreaming," she said. "Like I was watching myself from outside my body." That's when I realized what was happening. The store wasn't just trapping us physically. It was trying to trap us mentally, to make us part of whatever strange loop these other customers were caught in. I looked up at the clock. Still 11:47 p.m. My watch showed 2:31 a.m. We'd been in the store for over 3 hours. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Right now, before it gets us too." Mom nodded, but I could see the glazed look starting to return to her eyes. Whatever force was controlling this place was trying to pull her back in. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. Not a word, just a long, piercing shriek that cut through the artificial calm of the store like a knife. Every customer stopped what they were doing and turned to look at us. For just a moment, their mechanical movements ceased, and I could see confusion and fear in their faces, as if they were waking up from a dream they couldn't remember. In that moment of chaos, I heard something I'd been waiting for all night. Church bells chiming midnight from the old Methodist church down the street. As the 12th chime echoed through the store, everything changed. The extra customers vanished like smoke. The aisles returned to their normal, mostly empty state. Mrs. Chen was back, at her register, reading her magazine as if nothing had happened. The automatic doors whooshed open as a late-night customer entered, letting in a blast of cold February air. The clock above the pharmacy read 12 a.m. My watch read 12 a.m. Time had finally synchronized. "Come on," Mom said, her voice sharp and urgent. She grabbed my hand and practically dragged me toward the exit. We didn't stop to buy medicine. We didn't say goodbye to Mrs. Chen. We just ran through those automatic doors and across the parking lot to our car, our breath forming clouds in the freezing air. As we drove away, I looked back at Hartwell's Market. It looked exactly the same as it had when we arrived. A plain, fluorescent-lit grocery store sitting on an otherwise dark street. But I knew that we'd experienced something impossible, something that couldn't be explained by broken clocks or tired minds. "What happened in there?" I asked Mom as we drove through the empty streets toward home. She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she finally said. But we're never going back there after dark. Dad's fever broke on its own that night, without any medicine from the store. Mom always said it was just the natural course of the flu, but I wondered if leaving that place had somehow broken whatever hold it had been trying to establish over our family. I've researched Hartwell's Market many times over the years, trying to understand what we experienced that night. The building has an interesting history. It was constructed in 1962 on the site of the old Hartwell train station, which had been a major stop on the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1889 until 1961. The train station had seen its share of tragedy over the decades. In 1923, a passenger train derailed just outside town, killing 17 people. In 1945, a young woman threw herself in front of the 11:47 p.m. express, apparently distraught over news that her fiancé had been killed in the war. In 1958, an elderly man suffered a heart attack while waiting for a train that had been delayed by snow, and his body wasn't discovered until the next morning. Always the 11:47 p.m. train. Always some kind of tragedy or delay that left people stranded, waiting for transportation that would never come. Maybe that's what the store became, a waiting room for people who'd been traveling through time and gotten stuck somewhere along the way. Maybe we'd stumbled into a place where past and present overlap, where the normal rules of reality don't apply. Or maybe it was just a grocery store with broken clocks and strange customers, and my 10-year-old imagination filled in the rest. But I know what I experienced that night. I know that time can get twisted in certain places, that some buildings hold on to memories like sponges hold water. And I know that I've never been comfortable shopping alone after dark, no matter how normal the store appears. Hartwell's Market closed permanently in 2018. The official reason was declining sales and competition from a new Walmart 20 miles away. But I heard from my mom, who still lives in the area, that the real reason was complaints. Too many customers reported strange experiences. Time loss, disorientation, feeling like they were trapped in the store longer than possible. The building sits empty now, windows covered with plywood, and weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. But sometimes, when I'm driving through Ohio to visit my parents, I'll take the long way through Hartwell just to see it. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can see lights on inside. Fluorescent lights casting their familiar glow through the gaps in the plywood, illuminating aisles that shouldn't exist anymore. I never stop to investigate. Some places are meant to stay closed. But I wonder about those customers we saw that night. The man in summer clothes, the woman with her cart full of soup cans, the elderly man whispering to himself. Are they still in there, still going through the motions of shopping in a store that exists outside of normal time? And I wonder if, someday, some other family will get trapped in that place between 11:47 p.m. and midnight, searching for an exit that keeps moving farther away, watching the clocks run backward while their watches tick steadily forward into a future they might never reach. Time doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Most people never notice, but sometimes you get caught in the spaces between seconds, in the places where past and present collide. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the church bells chime at exactly the right moment, and you find your way back to the world where time moves in only one direction. But you never forget what it feels like to be lost in those spaces. You never stop checking your watch against every clock you see, making sure they still agree on what time it really is. Because somewhere, in a grocery store that shouldn't exist anymore, it's always 11:47 p.m., and the customers are still waiting for a train that will never come. Adults always tell kids to respect their teachers, to trust authority figures, to never question grown-ups who know better than you do. But what happens when the grown-up isn't who they claim to be? What happens when everyone else refuses to see what's right in front of them? I learned the answer when I was 9 years old, and it shaped every relationship I've had with authority ever since. My name is David, and I'm 29 years old now. But in the winter of 1995, I was 9 years old, and in 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary School in suburban Philadelphia. It was the kind of small school where everyone knew everyone else, where the same families had been sending their children for generations, and where nothing ever changed. My teacher was Mrs. Rodriguez, and I loved her like a second mother. She was everything a 4th grade teacher should be. Patient when you struggled with long division, enthusiastic about reading aloud from chapter books, and always willing to listen when you had a problem. She had this warm laugh that made you feel like you were the funniest person in the world, and she knew every student's name within the first week of school. Mrs. Rodriguez had specific habits that made her uniquely herself. She always wrote with her left hand, forming her letters in this distinctive backward slant. She called everyone sweetheart or honey, even when she was correcting behavior. Every Friday, she brought in homemade cookies for students who'd had a good week. And she had this nervous habit of tucking her hair behind her right ear when she was thinking. Most importantly, she knew us. She remembered that Tommy Martinez was allergic to peanuts, that Lisa Chen got carsick on field trips, that I was afraid of speaking in front of the class. She made each of us feel seen and understood in a way that only really good teachers can manage. We just returned from Christmas break in January when everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong came when I walked into our classroom that Monday morning. Mrs. Rodriguez was already at her desk, but something about her posture was different. She was sitting perfectly straight, hands folded, staring at the blackboard with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, distant. "Good morning, Mrs. Rodriguez," I said, hanging up my backpack in its usual spot. She turned to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were the same brown color they'd always been. Her face was identical, but there was something behind her expression that I didn't recognize, something that didn't belong there. "Sit down," she said curtly. Not, "Good morning, David," or, "How was your break, sweetheart?" Just, "Sit down." I took my seat, confused but not yet alarmed. Maybe she was having a bad morning. Maybe she was still tired from the holidays. But as more students arrived and morning announcements began, I realized this wasn't just a mood swing. This was something much more disturbing. Mrs. Rodriguez was writing the day's assignments on the blackboard, but she was using her right hand instead of her left. Her handwriting looked completely different, blocky and rigid instead of the flowing cursive we were all used to. And when she turned to address the class, she called Tommy Martinez Thomas and asked Lisa Chen to remind her about her food sensitivities. She didn't remember Tommy's peanut allergy. She didn't know that Lisa preferred to be called Lisa, not Elizabeth. She couldn't find the cabinet where she kept her reading glasses, even though it was the same cabinet she'd used every day for the first half of the school year. During math period, she handed out a worksheet on multiplication tables, which confused everyone because we'd already mastered that material in October. When Sarah Williams raised her hand to point this out, Mrs. Rodriguez snapped at her to focus on the task at hand, in a tone none of us had ever heard before. But the strangest thing was how she looked at us. Mrs. Rodriguez had always made eye contact when she spoke to students, but now she seemed to be looking through us, like we were obstacles she had to navigate around, rather than children she cared about. At lunch, I tried to talk to my classmates about the changes I'd noticed. "Don't you think Mrs. Rodriguez is acting weird today?" I asked Tommy and Lisa. They both looked at me like I was crazy. "She seems normal to me," Tommy said with a shrug. "Maybe a little tired, but teachers always are after Christmas break." "She called you Thomas this morning," I pointed out. "She's never called you that before." "So, that's my real name," Maybe she decided to be more formal. I stared at him in disbelief. She asked Lisa about her food sensitivities instead of your peanut allergy. She forgot you're allergic to peanuts, Tommy. I'm not allergic to peanuts, Tommy said casually, biting into a peanut butter sandwich. Where'd you get that idea? I felt like I was losing my mind. Tommy Martinez had been severely allergic to peanuts since kindergarten. The school nurse kept an EpiPen in her office specifically for him. We'd had classroom discussions about nut-free snacks because of his allergy. But he was sitting right in front of me, eating peanut butter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Lisa, I said desperately, you remember Tommy's allergy, right? She looked at me with the same confused expression. Tommy's not allergic to anything, David. Are you feeling okay? That afternoon, things got worse. Mrs. Rodriguez announced that we'd be having a spelling bee, which was something she'd never shown interest in before. She called students to the front of the room one by one, but she couldn't remember the order we usually sat in for classroom activities. She mispronounced Jenny Morrison's last name, calling her Miss Morimoto. She asked Kevin to spell words that were far too advanced for 4th grade, then seemed surprised when he couldn't manage them. And she kept watching me. Every time I looked up, her eyes were on me. Not the warm, caring gaze I was used to, but something calculating and cold, like she was studying me, trying to figure something out. After school, I stayed behind to clean the erasers, a job I'd volunteered for every week since September. But when I approached Mrs. Rodriguez's desk, she looked up with confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Cleaning the erasers," I said. I always clean the erasers on Mondays. "I don't need you to clean the erasers," she replied sharply. "Go home." I left the classroom feeling more confused than ever. Everything about Mrs. Rodriguez was wrong, but no one else seemed to notice. It was like I was the only person who remembered what she used to be like. That night, I tried to explain to my parents what had happened at school. "Mrs. Rodriguez is different," I told them over dinner. "She's not acting like herself." "Different how?" my mom asked. I struggled to put it into words. "She doesn't remember things about us. She's using her wrong hand. She's mean now." My parents exchanged one of those looks that adults give each other when they think a child is being dramatic. "Sweetheart," my dad said gently. "Teachers have bad days too. Maybe she's just stressed about getting back into the routine after vacation." "But she forgot Tommy's peanut allergy," I insisted. "And Tommy doesn't remember having it either." "David," my mother said firmly, "Tommy Martinez has never been allergic to peanuts. You're confusing him with someone else." I stared at my parents in shock. They knew Tommy's family well. Our mothers were in the same book club. They'd been to birthday parties, where we'd had to serve nut-free cake because of Tommy's allergy. But they looked at me with the same confused concern I'd seen on my classmates' faces. The next few days were like living in some kind of alternate reality. Mrs. Rodriguez continued to act like a completely different person, but everyone else seemed to accept this new version as normal. She handed out disciplinary assignments for minor infractions, raised her voice at students who asked questions, and seemed to take pleasure in pointing out our mistakes. She also started implementing new rules. No talking during independent reading time, something she'd never cared about before. No bathroom breaks during lessons, even for emergencies. And strangest of all, she began giving us vitamin supplements during lunch period. "These will help you focus and learn better," she explained, handing out small white pills from a bottle she kept in her desk drawer. Most of the kids took them without question, but something about the pills made me deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Rodriguez had never been interested in alternative medicine before, and she'd certainly never dispensed medication to students. I pretended to swallow mine, but spit it out into my napkin when she wasn't looking. Over the next week, I noticed changes in my classmates. They became quieter, more compliant. They stopped asking questions or offering their own ideas during discussions. They followed instructions without complaint, even when those instructions didn't make sense. It was like watching my friends turn into robots. Tommy, who used to be the class clown, sat silently at his desk for hours without fidgeting. Lisa, who'd always been eager to participate in every activity, now only spoke when directly addressed. Sarah, who used to argue with anyone about anything, agreed with everything Mrs. Rodriguez said without question. The only one who seemed unaffected was me, probably because I wasn't actually taking the pills. I tried to talk to my friends about what was happening, but they looked at me with blank, uncomprehending stares. It was like they couldn't even process what I was saying. "Don't you miss the way Mrs. Rodriguez used to be?" I asked Lisa during recess. "What do you mean?" Lisa replied in a flat, emotionless voice. "Mrs. Rodriguez has always been like this." "No, she hasn't. She used to bring us cookies on Fridays. She used to laugh at our jokes. She used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was thinking." Lisa stared at me with those empty eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about, David. You're acting very strange lately." That's when I knew I had to do something drastic. I went to the school library during lunch and asked Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, if I could look through old school newspapers. I found what I was looking for in the December issue, a photo of our class Christmas party, with Mrs. Rodriguez smiling warmly as she helped us decorate cookies. The woman in the photo looked exactly like our current teacher, but her expression was completely different. Warm instead of cold. Kind instead of cruel. Human instead of mechanical. I took the newspaper to Principal Henderson's office. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "I need to show you something important." He looked up from his paperwork with the patient expression adults reserve for children with trivial concerns. "What is it, David?" I spread the newspaper on his desk and pointed to the photo. "This is Mrs. Rodriguez at our Christmas party. Look at her face." He glanced at the picture. "Yes, it's a nice photo. Mrs. Rodriguez looks very happy." "But she doesn't look like that anymore," I said urgently. "She looks the same, but she's different. She's not the same person." Principal Henderson studied me carefully. "David, are you having problems at home? Is something bothering you?" "Mrs. Rodriguez isn't Mrs. Rodriguez," I said desperately. "Someone else is pretending to be her." His expression shifted from patience to concern. "That's a very serious accusation, son. What makes you think such a thing?" I told him everything. The change in handwriting, the forgotten details about students, the personality transformation, the mysterious pills. I could see skepticism growing in his eyes with every word. "David," he said finally, "Mrs. Rodriguez took a few days off sick just before Christmas break. When she came back, she might have seemed a little different because she wasn't feeling well, but she's certainly the same person she's always been." "Can you check her personnel file?" I asked. "Look at her handwriting samples or something." "I'm not going to investigate a teacher based on a student's imagination," he said firmly. "But I am going to call your parents and suggest they have you speak with the school counselor." That afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez kept me after class. "I understand you've been telling stories about me," she said, closing the classroom door behind her. I felt a chill of fear. There was something predatory in her expression, something that had never been there when she was really Mrs. Rodriguez. "I just think you're different," I said quietly. "Different how?" Her voice was soft, but there was a threat underlying the words. "You don't remember things about us. You don't act like you care about us anymore." She moved closer, and I instinctively backed away until I was pressed against the blackboard. "Let me tell you something, David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The woman who used to teach this class was weak. She cared too much about hurt feelings and hurt less about actual learning. She let you children run wild, filled your heads with nonsense about creativity and self-expression." She leaned down until her face was level with mine. "I'm a much better teacher than she ever was. Under my guidance, your classmates are becoming disciplined, focused, obedient. They're learning to follow instructions without question, to accept authority without argument. What happened to the real Mrs. Rodriguez? I asked, my voice shaking. Her smile was cold and sharp. She's gone, David. And soon, you'll forget she ever existed, just like your friends have. You'll take your medicine like a good boy, and you'll become just as well behaved as the rest of them. I won't, I said. Oh, but you will, she replied. Because tomorrow, I'm going to call your parents and tell them you've been having behavioral problems. I'm going to recommend that you be evaluated for attention deficit disorder. And the medication they prescribe will be much stronger than my little vitamin supplements. That night, I lay awake trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't convince the adults in my life that something was wrong because they all seemed to accept this new version of reality. My classmates couldn't help me because they were already under whatever influence those pills had over them. I was completely alone. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. During morning announcements, when Mrs. Rodriguez was facing the blackboard writing out our daily schedule, I stood up and spoke in the loudest voice I could manage. This woman is not Mrs. Rodriguez. The classroom fell silent. Every student turned to stare at me, and Mrs. Rodriguez slowly turned around with an expression of rage that made my blood freeze. "Sit down immediately," she said in a voice like ice. "No," I said, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. "You're not our real teacher. Our real teacher was kind and funny, and she cared about us. You're just pretending to be her. David, sit down right now, or you'll be going to the principal's office." "Good," I shouted. "I want to go to the principal's office. I want everyone to know that you're not who you say you are." That's when she made her mistake. Instead of maintaining her teacher persona, instead of continuing to pretend she was the same woman who'd taught us since September, she let her mask slip completely. "You stupid little boy," she snarled, taking a step toward me. "Do you have any idea how much better these children are now that I'm in charge? How much more disciplined and obedient they've become?" Her voice had changed, becoming harsher and more authoritative. Her posture was different too, more aggressive, like a predator preparing to strike. I've spent months turning these little brats into proper students, and I'm not going to let one defiant child ruin all my hard work. She reached into her desk drawer, but instead of pulling out the bottle of pills, she withdrew something that made my stomach drop, a syringe filled with clear liquid. "You're going to take your medicine, David, whether you want to or not." That's when the spell broke. My classmates, who'd been sitting in their seats like perfect little automatons, suddenly looked confused and frightened. The blank expressions disappeared from their faces, replaced by recognition and growing horror. "That's not Mrs. Rodriguez," Jenny whispered. "Where's our real teacher?" Tommy asked, his voice shaking. The woman who'd been impersonating Mrs. Rodriguez realized she'd been exposed. Her careful facade crumbled completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "You children don't understand," she said, still holding the syringe. "I was making you better. I was teaching you discipline, respect, obedience. The world needs more compliant citizens, not more free-thinking troublemakers." "Who are you?" Lisa demanded, and I was relieved to hear her real personality returning to her voice. "I'm someone who understands that children need strict guidance," the woman replied. "I'm someone who knows how to shape young minds properly, without all the coddling and permissiveness that weakens them." She took another step toward me, syringe raised. "And I'm someone who doesn't give up easily." That's when I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to the fire alarm on the wall and pulled it. The piercing sound of the alarm filled the classroom, and within seconds, the hallway was filled with the sounds of evacuation procedures. Teachers opened their doors. Students filed out in orderly lines. and Principal Henderson's voice came over the intercom, directing everyone to their emergency assembly points. In the chaos, the woman who'd been pretending to be Mrs. Rodriguez dropped the syringe and ran. Not toward the designated evacuation route, but toward the back exit that led to the parking lot. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd planned an escape route. By the time the fire department arrived and determined there was no actual emergency, she was gone. The investigation that followed revealed the truth that none of the adults had been willing to believe. Our real Mrs. Rodriguez had been found dead in her apartment 3 days after Christmas break began. The medical examiner determined she'd been murdered, though the killer had tried to make it look like a